Okay. Hi, everybody. We're going to give everyone a minute to sign on. I see it's a lot of people signing on. So let's give people a minute and then we'll get started. Okay, it's 11:01. We're going to get started. Thank you, everybody, and either good morning or good afternoon to Tuesday, August 10th. This is our day that we will be talking about history and preservation. It was on this day, August 10th, that our headquarters at 1044 Stockton was officially dedicated and open. We're going to look back on this day, on our history and what it represents, and looking forward to the lessons and the legacy that CACA conveys to America. We're going to start this morning off with, we have a very special guest to introduce. We have Congresswoman Grace Meng. She's from the 6th District of New York. Congresswoman Meng co-authored the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act and introduced legislation to study the creation of an AAPI museum. We have our moderators, Ken Hui, Vice President of Membership, and Ted Gong, our Vice President of Civic and Public Affairs. Congresswoman, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Melanie, and thank you to the entire Chinese American Citizens Alliance for inviting me here today. It's an honor to meet many of you for the first time, even though it is just virtually, but hopefully we can meet and spend time together in person one day soon. Thank you to CACA National for your tremendous work, and congratulations on the centennial anniversary of your headquarters in Stockton Street being dedicated and officially opened. It's heartwarming to see the great legacy that CACA has built and the impact that many of you have made on our communities all across the country. Despite the challenges that we have faced due to the coronavirus and the fatigue we all feel from Zoom meetings and events, I'm still glad that we get to gather here today. As you all know, I don't have to tell anyone on this Zoom, the last year and a half has been incredibly trying for our AAPI community. We have been crying out for help as we not just battle the deadly pandemic of COVID-19, but also the virus of anti-Asian hate and violence. And we all know too well the fear that our community has lived with, as we've seen Asian Americans being spat on, slashed, stabbed, beaten, pushed, verbally abused, and even killed. So many of our elderly and community members are literally scared to leave the house. Parents have to think twice before deciding whether to let their children return to in-person learning or to even go outside and play. And our community knows that, unfortunately, this hate is not brand new. For generations, the Asian American community has been treated as forever foreigners and have been victims of institutionalized discrimination at the hands of our own government. But so few are taught this part of our American history. As a kid, I barely learned about the Chinese laborers who built the Transcontinental Railroad, or about internment camps that Japanese Americans were sent to during World War II. My textbooks never mentioned the anti-Asian immigration laws that literally barred Asian immigrants from entering this country and becoming citizens simply because of the color of their skin. And it wasn't until I was much older that I learned about the contributions of Asian Americans to our nation, such as the 20,000 Chinese Americans who willingly volunteered to join our armed forces to fight for the United States of America in one of the deadliest military conflicts in world history. These stories of valor, patriotism, and perseverance in the face of discrimination and hate epitomize the best that America has to offer. And these stories must be told. And that's why I'm fighting for the inclusion of Asian American history in American civics and history program in our classrooms here throughout America. I also reintroduced my bill to establish a National Asian Pacific American Museum. My bill would be the first step towards ensuring our country preserves the unique history of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders for future generations. We cannot focus on tearing down the walls of biases and discrimination until we have a better and more complete teaching of what American history truly is. Museum is vital to ensure that others understand that our history and contributions are just as American as anyone else. And so I'm glad to join with you all today. Thank you for having me. I know that our communities have been through a really tough time, and I'm grateful that we can all be here together today.
All right, thank you, Congresswoman. I don't see Ted online with us, so I'll go ahead and proceed. And folks joining us, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A to ask your questions, and we will answer your questions or convey them to Congresswoman Meng. So while we're waiting, we have a question for you, Congresswoman. So you advocated for establishing the API Museum on the National Mall for several years now. And, you know, we know it took several years to achieve that objective. So in the meantime, how can the federal government help regional and small local museums to carry out their educational missions? Oh, there's Ted. Hey, Ted.
Yeah, I was signed on as a regular audience person.
Okay.
Great speech. So, yeah.
Hi, Ted.
How you doing? Yeah, you know, Ken just stole my question, but it's a question we're all very curious to hear, because I know you've been such a strong advocate for the API Museum National Mall. This is probably the third time we've had to reintroduce the bill. So it just shows you how long it takes to get that museum established. And even after the bill is passed, it's going to take a long time to get enough funding and enough of the artifacts and things that we want to put together to make sure that that place tells our stories. But so the question is, there's going to be a long period of time, maybe up to 6-7 years or something like this. What are we doing now in terms of getting federal budgeting and process to make sure that our strong regional museums, those in the ones that we know, the one in your place, MoCA, the one in Wing Look in Seattle, or the other Los Angeles or CHSA, these are the large ones, but there's also a ton of smaller ones too, ones in Mississippi and so forth, a huge number of programs. What can we do now to make sure that there's enough money to make sure federal funding for these small and other organizations? And how do we prevent the, say, a national museum from sucking away all the resources that regional museums also need?
Yeah, thank you, Ted. That's a great question. And thank you for your work as well. I think you and many people here on the call have played an important role in making sure that more people, including Congress, knows about the history of Chinese Americans and Asian Americans to this country. The bill that you mentioned that I introduced would establish a commission to study the potential creation of an AAPI museum in our nation's capital. And this is the first step and the beginning stage. We have tried and have worked to see how the African American Museum and the ongoing process of building a Latino museum and a women's museum have proceeded. And we are working in a similar manner. And hopefully by the time it gets to our museum, the process will be smoother, more efficient, and faster. My colleague, the late Congressman John Lewis, actually began introducing legislation to create a Museum of African American History in 1988. And it took until 2001 to establish a commission to study the feasibility of a Smithsonian museum. And it was another 16 years before the museum opened to the public in 2016, as you know. So we will have to be patient in this process. I do believe that as we are going over this process with additional museums since the African American Museum was opened, that hopefully the process will be faster. But I really strongly believe that even if it takes a long time, this is something that is very important. And I don't know if I will physically see the museum in my lifetime, but I do think that it's very important for us to get the process rolling. And the process is slow, but we are also able to, and this is where our community needs to continue to band together to spread the word, especially to our local partners. You're right, we have so many entities around the country that, to be honest, I've only started learning and visiting some of them as an adult in the last few years. And, most recently I went to the one in San Francisco, for example, which I had never been to. And so, one small, super anecdotal way that we can help this process is to encourage people in our own networks to visit and to support these institutions. And we're trying to do that here in New York as well. So there are, federal government has many grant programs. For example, the Smithsonian's Asian Pacific Center and the Institute for Museum and Library Services that can help directly provide support to local and regional museums to preserve and document the contributions of APIs to our history. And I would say on this Zoom, if people have questions or concerns in the future, if nothing's too small, if you have a question about your specific program in your state, please feel free to reach out to us, and we can try to get you information on how to connect you to some of these federal grant programs. But also, as I mentioned earlier, part of my desire to promote more API history in our school curriculum is because, as you know, when schools are teaching about different histories, along with that comes, programming, curriculum, and also field trips, for example. And so there may be increased opportunity as we're learning about API history to go visit and support some of these local institutions as well.
One of our participants asked, what is the name of the bill that you sponsor? What's the number that you have? The bill number?
I don't have the number on me. I can get it to Melanie and to all of you later on. Or if I find it, I'll put it in the chat.
But you know what I was thinking in terms of other processes is that the federal budget processing, is you're the head of the finance committee there for the House. But I'm thinking of things that can directly go to underserved communities so that we can up the bill or earmark bills funding directed toward underserved communities, which is Asian Americans and other organizations. Is there any effort to try to increase the bill fundings for NEH for distribution directly to the local museums or the programs that we have, very similar to, say, the money that's earmarked for Black history preservation of Black historical colleges and so forth?
Yeah. I mean, two things that I can think of off of more recent appropriations bills is that we got increased money through our committee. I'm not the head as much as I'd love to be. I'm just a member. But yeah, we were still able to steer increased funding to the Smithsonian's APA Center, which funds a lot of local programs. We're also working with them on something to, collect historical items in relation to Corky Lee, for example, which I know CACA has been super active on. And so there's increased funding there, and that means increased ways for the federal government, specifically here the Smithsonian, to partner with local entities. Also been working to get more recognition for institutions and appeasees, right? And this may lead to increased curriculum and programming at our higher education institutions as well. And there may be more, and Ted, we can always follow up and get the specific programs to you as well if you want.
If you're ever in California, you should visit our great museum in Los Angeles. Munson Kwok is down talking about that. So be sure to do that and visit our Summit Tunnel area. We have a great program going up there.
Nice, definitely.
Ken, you have some other questions that other people have?
Yeah, sure do. We had questions coming in from chat. And so from Helen Ying, our executive vice president, she asks, so how can groups like CACA help you in your efforts?
So national groups and local groups were super helpful during this past year and a half to pass two of my bills. One was a symbolic resolution that, said Congress stands against discrimination towards Asian Americans. This was just symbolic in nature, but we felt like it was very important to call attention to this issue. And this was passed, if you remember, in the early days of all that was going on. And we just wanted to make sure that Congress took a united and public stance to say, hey, knock it off. Like, these acts of discrimination and violence are not okay. Later on, as you know, we passed my bill with Senator Hirono, the Hate Crimes Act. And this is based off of feedback that we got from our local community. And so I will say, as tough as this past year and a half has been, one of the bright lights and one of the most important takeaways I believe that will help our community is that we've learned how to be even more effective civic activists. We've learned that yes, many of us have always spoken up, but the mainstream community and government and politicians have largely seen us as invisible or as foreigners and outsiders. And so I think that we really made headway this year by garnering the attention of our mainstream elected officials who are not Asian, beyond the Asian American community. And, if you remember, soon after Atlanta, there were Stop Asian Hate rallies all across the country. I remember they were held in places not just in California and New York, but New Hampshire and Maine. And so these are areas that traditionally don't hear a lot about the Asian community, but I thought that was beautiful. And I had colleagues from across the country who were putting together Asian American events and outreach type events, probably for the first time in their career. And I thought that that was wonderful. So as painful as this year and a half was, I think the fact that our community spoke up in such unison and with loud voices all around the country reminded people that we need to be included in these policy discussions as well. And so, obviously the community was super helpful in getting our legislation signed into law, but we need to make sure, and, I'm encouraged by a conversation I had earlier with Kin on how they're partnering with local entities and groups as well, because we need this done not just on a federal level, but our local communities, our local elected officials should be paying more attention to our community as well. So I really am, very hopeful after this year.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Question for our past national president, Munson Kwok. He asks, where in the federal budget do we advocate and educate for to increase funding support of regional and local institutions and projects? Is it, say, Interior?
So every agency probably has programs federal grant programs, for example, that can help our community. The problem with many of our community organizations is that they might not be well funded enough to, let's say, have a grant writer or researcher, right? So in some recent conversations, for example, that I've had with non-Asian community leaders, one way that I suggested they could help our community is to help our organizations, our nonprofits, seek out some of these grant opportunities. And this could in turn help us locally. It's hard to have dedicated staff, especially when you're a newer or smaller or lesser funded organizations, to literally sit there and comb through, all the federal grant opportunities there are. But the truth is there are a lot of grants out there. Our legislation that was just passed also, it's not just a bill. It's not gonna, the signing of the bill is not gonna end all discrimination against Asian Americans. But our bill did allocate $30 million through our appropriations process. It still needs to pass the Senate, but that it would literally direct federal money directly to our community-based organizations. You should understand, and you do because you're one of them, organizations like CACA are literally on the front lines. Remember when COVID first started and people were probably coming to you for help in your individual or organizational capacities. And they were coming to you for help because government didn't have all the answers. Government didn't even, we were asking them to, government didn't even provide, for example, information in different languages. So I had Chinese American constituents, like they didn't even know that we were on lockdown in the early days, right? They're working 2 jobs. They don't read, mainstream newspapers. They had no idea. They didn't have information in their language to tell them where they could go get testing, where they could get PPE. And so our community groups have literally been on the front lines of answering these questions and protecting our communities. And so, that's one of the reasons why I thought it was so important for our legislation to allocate funding for groups. And the Department of Justice is setting up the program and grants as we speak. And so Ted and Kin will make sure to put you on the list whenever they set up the application process. We'll make sure that the details.
Thank you very much. And we're going to jump over to another question. This is from Shu Wong of Albuquerque. She asks, how and why did you get into politics? And how do and can you encourage more Asian Americans to run for office?
I'm not sure my mom still likes the fact that I'm in politics. I don't know if I encourage more young Asian Americans to get involved. Maybe their parents won't like that. But you know what? I never intended to go into politics. I will tell you that I was a very shy kid. Even when I sat in class, I would try to sit in the back of the room. If I could make myself disappear, I would have. I hated when the teacher called on me. And, back when I grew up, there weren't a lot of Asians in my classrooms. And so I always felt a little embarrassed, like how come, my food, my mom would give me noodles or dumplings. How come it looks and smells different than everyone else's? But I will say that as I've gotten more involved in the community, what I try to tell people, especially young people, is that you don't need to be wealthy. You don't need to have a fancy title to make a difference in your community. One of the ways that I first got involved, my friends and I, we would set up, weekly, let's say, office hours, and we would have grandma and grandpas walk into our office. They couldn't read English. I had some grandmas, they would bring their mail to me every week. They would collect their mail. Let's say they would come in on a Friday, and I would help them translate the mail, right? Like this is not rocket science, but this was a service that my local neighborhood needed and it wasn't being provided. And so I encourage you all, if you're interested, whether you run for office or not, to get involved locally. It's even more important than, let's say, having a PhD in political science. What's most important is to get involved with your local community. And, whatever that topic may be, see your areas of interest, and then get involved, be a volunteer, and learn to be there for people, even if it doesn't directly impact you. We've been working a lot with some other groups, non-Asian groups, and one thing that the NAACP president said that I thought was great was to learn to be a friend before you need a friend, and really realize that there's so many ways that we can help other communities, and that strengthens our friendships and relationships. And we saw during this past year, there are Black leaders, Jewish leaders, many different leaders were outraged and speaking up for our communities. And so, just find ways that you are interested in to get involved. Nothing is too small. And, the more experience you build, the more, you'll see how rewarding it can be.
There was an interesting question talking about getting people involved. We all want to get involved, and we will get involved in our local events too. But on the larger national issues, particularly building the museum or some of these other things that you have. So really, for such a shy student, you say you are such an articulate spokesman. Really, you really are. And in the various public sessions that I've heard you speak, it's been a privilege. But we do have a question. How do we, as organization, get involved in maybe a larger strategy that you may be involved in that can help? Can we adopt something or get into a measure that helps support the program? It needs a sustaining effort of many people coming together. Is there a national strategy or suggestion of how we as an organization might adapt a policy or program that can help and support the effort?
Wow, that's a good question. And Ted, I feel like we need like another session to really address
Welcome.
really address that question. What I really believe in local impact, right? So you are all in different parts of the country. I see Texas, California, everywhere in between. And you kind of get a sense of what people on the ground are worried about, what they call you about. And likely that those are concerns that Chinese Americans in other parts of the country are facing as well. And so I think for us, it's important to be responsive and good listeners on the ground in our local community. And then we can see whether it's at a local and state level or whether it's at a federal level or all of them, if there are ways that we can address this. This past year and a half was really a crash course for our community. We saw legislation, we saw budgets pass, we saw so many ways that our community was helped on all different levels of government. And that's kind of something we have to do going forward all the time, even when we're not in crisis mode, right? We have to go to events with other community members and elected officials. We have to hold events and invite them. And I've even called out some of my colleagues. I said, I hope, I know some of you have been to Asian American events for the first time ever, probably in your life this past year, but make sure that continues. I don't want it to end in 2020 and 2021. Make sure that Asian Americans are still on your radar as you're working on policies and on budgets. And so, I don't want to say that we have to speak up, because truth is we have been speaking up for a while, but now that we've kind of gotten the attention of some folks, we need to make sure that we're doing it on a regular basis, whether that's advocating for like funding for a specific program in your neighborhood, or pushing legislation either in your state legislature or Congress. We need to make sure that they're hearing our voices, because otherwise people might forget about us.
Thank you. I don't know, Ken, how much time we still have, but I do have one other question I'd like to ask.
I think we have another minute before the Congresswoman has to leave. Is that right?
Do we have others? But let me raise one, and there may be others. People have a specific one about how our museums might be able to join in the discussions about building or planning for the National Museum on the Mall. But the one thing is, Can you sort of explain how the historical preservation and storytelling of our stories, the Chinese American stories, relates to the Black Lives Matter movement or the anti-Asian crimes that we're now facing?
Yeah, this has been one of the toughest topics, I think, for our community to talk about this past year. But I also am really hopeful. I myself have been part of conversations, even here in New York, which is such a diverse area. But we've brought Black and Asian leaders together, sometimes for the very first time. So I remember in the early weeks after Atlanta, we were on a Zoom. We gathered some Black and Asian leaders on the Zoom together. And there were things that were discussed, for example, Asians talking about how prevalent poverty is in our community. And people were surprised. There's that assumption that we are all doctors and wealthy. And that's not true. We know that that's not true, but other people might not have known that it was true. I actually had the opportunity. I went to Georgia with KPAC soon after the murders that happened there and met with some of the families. And one of the families that I met with was a Korean American woman who had died. She had two sons that were half Korean, half Black. And so there's actually a really good article in the Washington Post, I believe, just in the last few days, where it talked about his experiences. And he is someone that is a wonderful example about how we need to talk more and learn more about the partnership and the history that our communities have. When we talk about Japanese reparations in this country, it was a lot of Black activists and leaders who helped the Japanese community achieve that. And so there's so much more that we have in common with each other. And when sometimes people will bring up issues, they'll say, well, the perpetrator was Black, and, I say that might be the case. That's certainly not, contrary to what media shows us, that is not the majority of the cases. And how can we be constructive in our conversations, and how can we use these examples to break down these walls of stereotypes that too many people have, and which goes back to learning about history. But locally, for example, we have a project, for example, a local Asian organization is partnering with Black community leaders, and they're bringing fresh produce to some of the local neighborhoods because that's been a problem. And many in that certain Black community felt like the Asian business leaders there didn't care about them, even though they spent money at their businesses. And so there's so many misconceptions that happen because of there's not enough communication. And we all live side by side. We talk about my home state of New York being so diverse, but the truth is we don't interact as often as we should be. We kind of live side by side, right? And so I take this past year and a half as a sign of hope on what we can learn from each other. And again, I'll say it, like in the beginning, maybe you were all more put together than I was. I felt so lost and so hopeless. In the early days, I even went on Google one day. I said, I want to put together an event or program. And I literally went on Google and I'm like, I don't even know what to Google. There's no guidebook here. You and I, we are creating this path, this roadmap, and we are making history. When we put together, as I've done often here, Jewish, Asian, Black leaders in one space, that's kind of making history. Reverend Al Sharpton came out to Flushing to our Stop Asian Hate rally. That's making history, right, between our communities. And so I really see this as a huge sign of hope for all of us. There's a lot that we can learn. I'll end with this. When I got into politics, I didn't know what I was doing. I wouldn't say it back then, but I was so lost. I didn't grow up talking and learning about politicians, but a lot of my colleagues and, my Black colleagues and colleagues from other communities kind of took me under their wing, and they kind of showed me the way. And I learned that, our community can often benefit from the struggles that they've already gone through. So how can we learn to be a better advocate from what they've gone through?
Thank you.
All right. So Congresswoman, again, thank you so much for your time. I know you're a bit busy lady, but again, we want to thank you for everything you've done for the community and really what you did with the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act. And just to plug, I do have a session coming up on Thursday at 12:30 Pacific time, and I'll share with everybody what San Antonio Lodge did, how we got to creating those formal agreements with our local law enforcement officials. And again, this is to implement Section 5 of the Act. So again, Melanie?
Ken, I would love to see that as well. I think that'd be really useful for a lot of people.
Okay, great. Thank you. Melanie, back to you.
Thank you, Congresswoman, for joining us. It was a very stimulating talk, and it's giving a lot of our membership some thoughts for the future. And, just looking at all the chat, there's a lot of interest in helping to support, this effort. So I'll be putting some stuff together and I'll send it to Ted to maybe forward to you. But thank you again for your time, and we appreciate everything that you've done for the community. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Keep up the great work. Keep in touch.
We are going into for the rest of the group, we're going into a 10-minute break. We will come back at 11:45 for our next session. Let me see. Did we put the next Zoom into the chat yet? Let's see. Let me see if I can do that quickly. I think this is the Zoom link for our next session, which will be on our building's legacy. So I'm going to be ending this meeting, and our next one will be in 10 minutes. So please sign on in 10 minutes.